Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this online event, which is part of our Envisioning Europe series of lectures. Thank you all for joining us tonight. A special thanks to our lecturer for this evening, Professor Segers, and to Professor Kühnhardt for agreeing to moderate the discussion. Both are experts in European integration matters. Ludger Kühnhardt is a professor of political science at Bonn University and heads its Center for European Integration. Mathieu Segers is a professor of contemporary European history and European integration at Maastricht University. In his lecture tonight, Professor Segers will examine Europe through its integration process and will ponder whether there is any future for its transatlantic component. A very interesting and contemporary topic indeed. Just some days ago, in its latest edition, news organization Politico published a story under the telling headline, "All is not well in the transatlantic relationship." According to the news story, a year after Joe Biden became US president, the high expectations of a quick fix and return to the pre-Trump era of EU-US relations have subsided. Yes, things have improved, but frictions remain on a series of issues of global importance. These issues bring to the fore Europe's role and give rise to the seemingly perennial question of what is Europe and what kind of Europe do we want? Questions that are at the heart of our museum. From antiquity to the post-Second World War era to today, the House of European History demonstrates how Europeans try to provide answers to these difficult questions. For instance, in our Europe Now section, we exhibit the Union flag that was taken down from the Jacques Delors building of the Committee of the Regions in the course of Brexit. A coat made of used deflated balloons from the UK that were found on the Belgian coast reminds our visitors of climate change and of the environmental challenges we all face. The exhibition also shows the development of the European integration process, progressing eventually through crisis and setbacks. And beyond its innovative supranational organization, our exhibition also explores, going further back in history, how after each major war in Europe, new ways of multilateral cooperation were explored. One could mention, for example, the Congress system, the international organizations founded in the 19th century, and again after World War I and World War II. Or the many different ideas to organize peaceful cohabitation in Europe. Today, there's virtually no political field which does not have its international organization or NGO. But how effective are they in addressing the challenges of today? Dear Professor Segers, dear Professor Kühnhardt, dear participants, one of the more recently published histories of the European Union was titled Die Unvollendete, the Unfinished, referring to the famous Unfinished Symphony of Franz Schubert. I think that the symphony is a very nice image for the polyphonic harmony needed for multilateral cooperation. But the title can of course be used to refer to much more serious questions. Can the European Union ever be finished? Can Europeans agree on a finality? Which multi-level governance and multilateral world order is the best to address the challenges of today? How many different instruments, to remain within the image, or players are suitable for the concert of Europe, to refer to a term used in the 19th century? How many conductors? And how to avoid that polyphony turns into cacophony, notably vis-à-vis the big solo players of today's world? Food for thought. I'm very curious to hear how both of you envision Europe. Thank you very much for being with us tonight, and I wish you a very fruitful debate. And I now hand over to Professor Kühnhardt for his introductory remarks. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Itzel, for this nice word to help us getting into a fascinating evening, which is ahead of us. We are very fortunate to welcome a Dutch citizen of the world with a French first name, a certain inclination for German philosophy, talking about the Faustian bargain, for instance, or using the title Sturm und Drang in one of the chapters in one of his books, one very distinguished book, highly lauded, not only as the Dutch political book of the year 2013, but also published and widely spread across Europe. Reis naar het continent, Travel to the Continent, was published in English with this wonderful title. I hope you can see it with this cover picture, which says a lot about tonight's author. This is Odysseus seduced by Calypso, a painting by the German painter Arnold Böcklin, painted in 1883, just a few months ahead of the beginning of the travel to European integration, which began so miraculously in the middle of the 20th century. And then his book, Reis naar het continent, the Netherlands and European integration, 1950 to present, Professor Mathieu Segers discusses indeed the question whether his country, the Netherlands, were kind of seduced into European integration as much as poor Odysseus was seduced by Calypso to stay on her island, or whether we were all together trapped in this integration process as much as Odysseus was at his time. You see, we are fortunate to welcome tonight an academic with a strong inclination for cultural symbolism and interesting perspectives and reflections. Professor Segers joins us in the middle of a fascinating and very successful academic career, which has brought him to Harvard University, to Oxford University, and needless to say, since a good number of years, he is professor of contemporary European history and European integration at Maastricht University. In a way, given the many activities he is involved in, one could also call him an activist academic, a manager of different academic projects, all dedicated to European integration, its history, and as he likes to be labeled, its prehistory. This does lead us immediately, of course, to the time of Odysseus, but also to the early days of European integration. Professor Segers, in an interview, has stated recently that it is one of the most important obligations of academics to translate not just in terms of languages from Dutch into English or into French, into German, into Italian, etc., into Polish, and in all the other wonderful languages which bring us together here in the European Union, but also to translate academic work and academic symbolism into real life, so to say, into the world of non-academics. And he is a very gifted and talented intellectual in doing so time and again in his work. And this is why I said we are very fortunate to listen now to his reflections on what a clumsy, heavy term here, the vicissitudes of European integration. In my simple analysis, it always boils down to the basic assumption that Europe needs crises in integration to move ahead. We should avoid crises of integration, but crises in integration can be very healthy. They are, as Professor Segers would probably call it, vicissitudes. And what that means and how you translate this to us who are looking forward to listen very carefully and with great joy and surely to be enriched by your reflections, you will tell us now. The floor is yours, Mathieu Segers. Thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Professor Kühnhardt. And I will start right away, dear audience. Ladies and gentlemen, what is Europe? Few have posed this question more provocatively than Margaret Thatcher did in 1988, in front of a shocked audience of Eurocrats at the College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium. She cried this question, what is Europe? And the Iron Lady herself had a rather clear-cut answer to this question, and I quote her. These men, as Margaret Thatcher called her colleagues, heads of state of government at European summits and other European gatherings, these men, all they do is anecdote away, never get down to business, unquote. This was what Europe was to Margaret Thatcher, and maybe it is a not so unapt description of what it boils down to way too often still. Being a man myself and an historian, what I will do for the next roughly half an hour is anecdote away a bit on Europe's contemporary European history. And oh dear, there we go. According to the British historian Norman Davies, it is the First World War that marks the beginning of a period of 75 years, the period during which Europe was divided by the longest of its civil wars, lasting from 1914 until 1990. The longest of Europe's civil wars only ended in 1990 with the peace treaty with and regarding Germany, as you all know. It was this treaty that put an end to the Order of Yalta and Potsdam and reunited Germany. The peace treaty of 1990 also laid the foundations for the end of the Cold War and the reunion of Europe, facilitated by the process of European integration and re-enshrined in the Treaty on European Union signed in Maastricht 30 years ago these days. In 2017, at the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Treaty of Maastricht, Federica Mogherini, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, gave a speech in Maastricht. In her speech, Mogherini concisely summarized the grand ambitions which were put black on white then. And I quote Federica Mogherini, "The Treaty of Maastricht was a revolution. For the first time in the history of the world, building peace became the aspiration of an entire continent." Federica Mogherini is a child of the 1990s, just like me and probably many others who will follow this lecture or will view it at a later moment. Mogherini was born in 1973 and went to the university in the early 90s. In her speech in Maastricht 5 years ago, Mogherini recalled the spirit of that time, the 1990s, and said, and I quote her again, "I remember very well the hopes of my generation at the end of the Cold War, the bold hopes and expectations for a new global order," unquote. I remember this too. These hopeful and free and yes, in many ways, truly multicultural years. This lucky in-between of contemporary Western European history, the years between the fall of the Berlin Wall and 9/11. But today this memory often seems fading away, even seems to disappear from the collective memory of my own generation. Just like the songs we loved back in the 1990s, those days when the song you loved would have its moment on the radio and then disappear into the nothing. According to Norman Davies, Europe's longest civil war started with the First World War in 1914. Up to the present day, however, nobody knows exactly why this happened. In spite of libraries, field research and historical reconstruction on the topic, we still are quite in the dark with regard to that crucial question, why? Why did Europe start the war that ended peace? Looking back at that fatal moment in European history, the French novelist Roger Martin Dugard, during the 1920s and 1930s, wrote his great family epic entitled Les Thibauts. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of gripping prose in which he describes the incomprehensible rally around fake news and real bluff in the run-up to World War I. This maddening rat race of the grandstanding of nations and certain individuals, which promptly became too violent and too powerful for Europe. In the last part of his book, Martin Dugard describes the summer of 1914, during which literally nobody could escape the great transition from peace and freedom to war and coercion. This transition, which would convert the Europe of before the Great War into die Welt van gestern, in the words of Stefan Zweig, a sweet but lost world. This transition during which everything happens as if the individual, while living in peace, had forgotten something essential about the social condition, namely that he is powerless without others, and that where others are powerless, he is too. The nearness of others. This characterizes European life. Contemporary European history starts with the interweaving of families and regions, the realities of the local community, which encapsulate a pan-European history, not of nations, but of families. Or as Sigmund Freud once said, all history is family history. Europe's future is anchored not so much in Brussels, but in these regional, provincial places. These places where official histories get messed up. These places where family ties are old and often characterized by migration, and where diversity inspires, but also strikes terror. These elegant small cities, provincial capitals and towns where modesty and pride compete for dominance, and change of events are set in motion. Cities like Sarajevo and Maastricht. In 2017, Federica Mogherini chose Maastricht, my hometown, a city that sometimes, in moments of particular self-confidence, refers to itself as the balcony of Europe. Mogherini chose this city to remind us that, and I quote her again, it's up to us to decide what happens next in Europe. And she furthermore stressed, and I quote, it is us and only us who can make the difference in the Balkans. She probably was right then, and she probably still is right today. The true original balcony of Europe is somewhere else though. Quite far away from here in geographical terms, actually. It is at the border of Eastern Europe and Western Asia, deep in the Caucasus. There, the country Georgia, cherishing its persistent Western outlook, traditionally calls itself the balcony of Europe, maybe against all odds. A couple of years ago, the young female Georgian writer, Nino Haratischvili, burst upon the European literary scene with a book entitled Das achte Leben. It was also written in German first. Haratischvili's book is another European epic masterpiece. It's built around different generations of a Georgian family and records contemporary European history and its endemic and saddening struggle with totalitarianism. And somewhere in the book, Haratischvili grapples with the balcony of Europe metaphor, to which her country so consistently holds on to. Haratischvili calls this more or less official metaphor for her country ironic and poetic at the same time. A balcony enables you to have an outlook beyond one's own daily life and identity. At the same time, however, a balcony remains an isolated place. And when looking out from a balcony over Europe, it is history that meets the eye. And many of it is brutal history. A brutal history of geopolitics and the European appetite for expansion. A war cemetery, a mass grave, or a killing field is never far away. And guilt is always present somehow. Our Europe counts numerous balconies. Some of these balconies are now located in the Europe of European integration. Others are at the rough fringes of the European Union. But they are all built on the enormous complexities of the local histories, their glory and tragedy, their brute facts and delicate secrets. They are built on these stories in which time rules and politics and power become the psychological relation they in essence always remain. Now imagine that we would set off from these balconies of Europe now at this very moment, and that we would fly like a bird or a drone, if you like, over our Europe. The first thing we would see is the city of Paris. The city of love and deceit, ideas and art, resistance and cooperation. The city of feminine elegance and poetry in motion. The traditional modern example for every other European city of our times. The European capital par excellence, enlightened and romantic at the same time. The city of revolution, but also of an eternal ancien regime. And of course, the city of dining, dancing, singing and swinging. This city where you may reflect and forget, learn and unlearn. At every balcony of Europe, without exception, example is taken from Paris. Tbilisi, the Georgian capital, is called the Paris of Georgia. And in Maastricht, the city quarter called weak has been labeled the Quartier Latin of Maastricht. Even Boston and St. Petersburg want to mirror Paris. Seen from Europe's balconies, contemporary Europe is like Paris, traditional and trendy at the same time. But what is happening in the streets of present-day Paris? What is happening in the Paris of today? Is there still something left of the hopes of the 1990s? More than 5 years ago now, on 13 November 2015, raw terrorist attacks hit Paris. 129 people died, of which 89 were shot in the Bataclan theater. You all know this. Paris was in shock again, and Europe was in shock again. Immediately after the attacks, there was a run on a book entitled A Movable Feast. A Movable Feast is a booklet from the famous American writer Ernest Hemingway. And in the book, the young Hemingway recounts his adventures among the American community in Paris in the 1920s, working, partying and growing up on the Rive Gauche. There, Paris was an electrifying city where these American youngsters were caught in the black web of an ancient and amoral European culture, as they described it themselves. This was something very different from American dreams, but they loved it. But the scenery of their année folle was made up of the sinister aftermath of the unprecedented devastations of World War I. The Europe they loved was a traumatized Europe, dangerously insecure and feverish. This was the Europe that was captured by the German-Swiss painter Paul Klee in the 1930s in his beautiful but daunting painting Europa. The painting portrays the goddess Europa, still a goddess, but one of despair and expressionism. Back to those dark Paris November days in 2015. Then buying the Hemingway memoir, A Movable Feast, this booklet, this memoir of Paris, of Hemingway, the years he had in Paris. Buying this book offered some strange sort of consolation. After the shock of terror, the title and the subject of Hemingway's book, A Movable Feast, referring to Paris as a movable social gathering of wining and dining, appealed to the imagination. That is to say, to those who were frequenting the outdoor cafes again, while the pavements around Bataclan Theatre were still stained with blood. And it was this situation that was illustrative for the unsettling mood in Paris and Europe as a whole. Europe was out of balance, staggering maybe, looking for support surely, and again. And for this support, it looked west again. In the winter of 2014, one year earlier, the victims of Maidan Square in Kiev had done the same, looking west for support. Georgia had done the same in 2008. But the West they hoped for, the European culture they felt part of, remained a phantom. That same phantom which lingered above the bloody streets of Budapest in 1956 and above the Central European University of Michael Ignatieff until recently. Looking back on the Paris autumn of 2015, only 6 years ago, we now may conclude that this probably was the last time in contemporary Western European history that this looking west for help happened so spontaneously and hopefully in Europe. Back then, in that autumn of 2015 in Paris, Brexit and President Trump were still in the making. Since then, we here in Western Europe are swiftly becoming more and more Eastern Europe-like, more vulnerable, whether we like it or not. The brute facts of history and geopolitics are simple as that. Indeed, much has happened since 2015. Future historians even may conclude that then, 2015, and now, 2022, are two worlds apart. Two worlds which together sketch the closing of an era, marking the phase of transition we are in right now. A transition in which the American century, the short but intense century of Americanization, transatlantic hopes and successes, the century in which present-day Europe was built, draws to a close. This begs questions. Which world are we leaving and what are we heading for? Politically, the takeoff of the American century was marked by the active involvement of American diplomacy in the peace negotiations after World War I in 1990. The US delegation and its entourage to these negotiations in Paris included every young diplomat, journalist, and intellectual who could invent an excuse to be present at what has been called America's geopolitical coming out party. It also was the beginning of what some of them called their, or the American, love affair with Europe. Yes, it was a time in which America's madmen were still in diplomacy instead of in advertising or big tech. These American youngsters would shape the post-war Western world after World War II. After that Second World War, they considered the Great Depression of the 1930s and the devastating inequality, nationalism, and racism it unleashed as a key cause of the horrific violence which had raped Europe during the Second World War. Hence, the battling of poverty in Europe was at the heart of their American mission. Their mission, which these Americans summarized as building Europe. It was through these Americans that the US economy of abundance got connected to the hungry people and poor markets of Western Europe. And most crucially, that this coupling was enshrined in unprecedented treaties of transatlantic multilateralism. It was through these Americans that the famous American cultural diplomacy worked, creating a more stable Western Europe while experimenting with capitalism and democracy at the same time, all embedded in a Franco-German reconciliation and within international organizations which often were explicitly linked to the rule of law and the promotion and practice of human rights. And their mission, this American mission and experimenting, brought unbelievable successes. What we may have forgotten, however, is that in those days of the 1940s, the battle against poverty was also understood as a fight against unregulated capital markets. Or in the words of Henry Morgenthau, the US Treasury Secretary in the early 1940s, and I quote Morgenthau, "The task that statesmen should set themselves is to drive the usurious moneylenders from the temple of international finance. The institutions of a new international order ought to be instruments of sovereign governments and not of private financial interests." Unquote, the Secretary of the Treasury of the US in the 1940s. And indeed, capital controls would become the true and only backstop in the system of Bretton Woods that started in 1944. In the monetary union and the Eurozone of today, this essential part of the mission of building Europe may be very relevant again. And the same might go for the interlinked battle against monopoly and oligarchy and the vested interests and inequality they nourish. These battles have been at the core of the founding of European integration, but seem to be less and less recognized as such. During the first phases of the post-war era, a transatlantic dream became true. Atlantis existed. But just like the Atlantis of the classics, it still has to be discovered. And there, underneath the surface, deep diving towards the lost Atlantis, we now find that European integration always has been a project in search of an idea. European integration is the constantly changing outcome of an ongoing battle of ideas concerning what Europe may or should become in the future. And this battle of ideas works across national frontiers, and it cross-cuts member states, as well as political parties within them. And crucially, no idea, no plan, vision, or grand design has ever been strong enough to continuously subordinate the alternatives to its institutional logic. This deeper reality, however, is a reality we have not yet seen clearly enough, and there is a reason for this. As of the beginning of European integration, a striking match existed between the emerging integration process on the one hand and the national economic and political goals its member states set themselves on the other. Goals like stability and welfare. And this striking match, geopolitically made possible thanks to NATO, enabled the governments of the member states of European integration to do something extraordinary, to claim that they were in control. This is a fairy tale. What happened in reality was something rather different. The integration process that took off was beyond the control of a single national government. No capital could steer its course. In fact, every capital, in its own way, steered a quite erratic course in the matter of European integration, except perhaps for the Federal Republic of Germany. Im Nachhinein sind alle klüger. That is especially true for the member states of European integration. One of the things we are rediscovering through recent archival research is that our post-war American Europe, in essence, might not have been much more than a flush of escapism, the other side of the escapism of Ernest Hemingway, so to say. An escape from politics and history for traumatized Europe into a more apolitical and more comfortable sphere of policy, technocracy, and Anglo-Saxon management of market forces. An escape which almost seemed nothing less than a re-enlightenment sometimes, after the medieval darkness of the first half of Europe's 20th century. But it also might have been, like every escape is in the end, a temporary fix of geopolitics, idealism, and an historic American self-confidence. And this implies that the American Europe never replaced the older European Europe, that from a European perspective, European integration up to now was never more than a very successful form of management of decline for Europe's worn-out nation state. Ladies and gentlemen, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s marked the beginning of the suffocation of this transatlantic love affair. Yes, it marked the end of the coordinated Western world described as the system of embedded liberalism by the American political scientist John Ruggie. This system of, very crudely summarized, the system of Keynes at home and Smith abroad, slowly but surely transformed in a system of market decontrol, an extreme liberation of financial markets in particular, after US President Richard Nixon had pulled the plug of capital decontrol. Ironically, the historic Western victory of the fall of the Berlin Wall marked the definite end of the transatlantic love affair. And today we are still struggling with accepting this new reality. We are looking for help, but when we look west now, what we see is a living reflection of the Roman goddess of Paul Klee, dressed up in the Star-Spangled Banner. The Treaty of Maastricht was Europe's first effort to deal with this totally new situation of today, to cope with the transition from Pax Americana into a more European history again. And what do we see if we look closer into that European Europe that was hidden so long behind the Pax Americana? When Western Europe was put on the drip of the Marshall Plan, Prague, the Czechoslovak capital, was on the eve of the 1948 coup d'etat, in which the Czech Communist Party, with Soviet backing, assumed control over the government, marking the onset of 4 decades of communist rule in the country. In the communist break that emerged from this, the philosopher Jan Patočka ran the so-called underground university, as he was banned from teaching. And Patočka's underground university was an informal institution in people's living rooms. And what it tried to do was offer a free, uncensored cultural education, a European education. Here people could take part in an impressive attempt to live in truth, as Patočka's student Václav Havel recalled later. The Socrates of Prague, as Patočka was called, taught his students that history is not a story with a plot and a happy ending, but a relentless struggle against obfuscation through lies, against the absolutism of rationalization and consumerism, and against all those other human banalities that spell the end for inspiration and openness. He explained, Patočka explained, that Europe had to fight this struggle time and again, and that if it fails to do so, Europe will wallow in the delusion of pretense once again, pretending that simple solutions will make problems disappear, and pretending that propaganda is art, and pretending that propaganda is education or science. It's very topical. When the Berlin Wall came down, the former students of Jan Patočka and Jan Patočka's underground university probably knew more about the strengths and weaknesses of our open Europe of those days than we Western Europeans did. While we looked west, they tried to reinvent the West, rooted in the difficult but essential exercise to practice human rights. And they felt this was urgent, because Patočka had prepared them for what he had called post-Europe, a further manifestation of the crisis of Western civilization, which in his days had manifested itself in the form of socialist totalitarianism. However, at the moment of the signing of the Treaty of Maastricht, a fundamentally other Europe seemed to emerge. That Europe even seemed to make fun of its own contemporary history. That Europe seemed to defy the very rules and laws of contemporary European history. Which were these rules? In November 1959, the Latvian-British philosopher Isaiah Berlin gave a long-forgotten lecture to the Third Congress of the Fondation Européenne de la Culture in Vienna. It was one of the exceptional moments when Berlin ventured to tackle the problem of European unity, the problem of European unity. His lecture was entitled European Unity and its Vicissitudes, its ups and downs, its kidnappings. In his speech, Isaiah Berlin addressed the issues of the constant ups and downs in Europe's unity. And in a key passage, he explains their dynamic. His words remain very topical today, and I quote Isaiah Berlin. European history is a kind of dialectic between the craving for public order and for individual liberty. And Berlin continued, The quest for order is a kind of fear before the elements, an effort to preserve the banisters that human beings need to prevent them from toppling over into an abyss, to connect them with their past and point a path to the future. But when institutions become too set and obstruct growth, order becomes oppression, and sooner or later it is broken through by an almost physiological desire to live, to create, and by the need for novelty and change, unquote. This is a gripping description of the rhythm of European history. What Berlin captures here are the two souls of the West, of European culture: enlightenment and romanticism, reason and emotion, calculation and sentiment. And those two souls form the far ends in between which the pendulum of European history swings, from the one end to the other and back again. And this pattern of ups and downs, vicissitudes, this swinging between reason and emotion, light and dark, revolution and ancien regime, is a pattern that fits the dominant concepts of the 20th century thought, from the dialectic of Hegel and Marx to the creative destruction of Joseph Schumpeter. A pattern that tells us that any fundamental change must be accompanied by the violent breakup of the existing order. But this seems to be a too simplistic scheme to catch the European 1990s. This diaphragm of contemporary European history, this lucky in-between from the fall of the Berlin Wall to 9/11, during which Europe's vicissitudes were suppressed in conversations and negotiations. Because back then, in the 1990s, there existed broad consensus that order of cooperation and reconciliation was not and would not become an oppressing one. On the contrary, the existing order was perceived and was believed to remain a freeing order, an order that would sabotage the pendulum of European history, revolution without revolution. Indeed, what Europe tried to do with the Treaty of Maastricht was to explicitly step out of this maddening pendulum of European history, to bolster the institutions of cooperation that it had created already during the American century, so as to make them fit for the next century. But already in 1999, that future year in which the artist formerly known as Prince threw the best party ever, in that year, 1999, the Polish philosopher Zygmunt Bauman asked a pressing and topical question, and I quote Bauman: "How does it come about that human ability to imagine a better world was not among the trophies of victory?" Unquote. Bauman was referring to the unbelievable victory of the 1990s here, the unbelievable European victory over its own history. And his question was, why did we lose the ability to imagine a better world? The answer to this question of Bauman might be that we got high again on a late but very powerful rush of the transatlantic intoxication that had characterized the second half of the European 20th century, a fresh rush of the primacy of policy and technocracy over politics, which also manifested itself in the European Monetary Union and enabled us to push back the daunting history of European politics once more, escaping history one last time, reveling in comfort, efficiency, and the endless policies of upscaling. If we want to protect the true spirit of the open 90s, instead of to ridicule it, we must work on it. The high hopes of the new Europe were made explicit then, but they are not very visible anymore, neither in the media nor in politics. Too few know about their existence, and they may even go underground in the future. And from this perspective, it is indeed very urgent that we start writing and archiving the history of the European 90s. Yes, it's up to us to research our own Europe and address it as critically as we can, test it, and in so doing, try to cherish that essential European lesson about the social condition, that man is powerless without others, and that where others are powerless, he is too. Ladies and gentlemen, no peace and happiness without the daunting threat of usurpation and fatal misunderstandings. That tension will never disappear. But what can disappear, and quite swiftly so, is tolerance, is freedom, cooperation, human rights, the rule of law. They can disappear between two autumns. Yes, what European history teaches us is that few things can disappear as promptly as freedom. Just like that. Anyhow, that is what we conclude ex post facto, after the fact. Afterwards, we realized that the fundaments of peace were too vulnerable for the beating forces that were ridiculed or neglected for too long. Afterwards, we realized that fortune seldom lasts longer than a moment in time. And it's only afterwards, after the excitement and the rush, that we hear the nuanced, worried, and alarming voices that preceded the disaster. Today, we continuously tell each other that we live in an ex post facto Europe, a Europe after the fact, the Europe that comes after the longest of its civil wars. But that after is long gone. With the extinction of the generation that lived through World War II and its aftermath, the after suffocates and changes reality. It is a truism that the after of the old days transforms into the before of today. What we experience is a change of winds, an annunciation of a new reality shaped by the brute facts of geography and history. And now it's up to us to cherish, nurture, and renew the desiderata of the old after order in the challenging circumstances of the emerging new order. In other words, to imagine a better world, and work on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathieu, for this very thoughtful presentation. When Professor Segers was born in 1976, Europe started what economists later labeled a decade of Eurosclerosis. I think in light of the freshness and strength of the brain we have just experienced, Mathieu Segers proved this label wrong, that he was born in a decade of Eurosclerosis. We heard the opposite, a brain full of, a life full of imagination and creativity, a noble heir in a way to Isaiah Berlin and his reflection on the vicissitudes of Europe. But I think, and this brings us into our discussion here tonight, Professor Segers, in a way you have also questioned yourself the defeatism of Odysseus being seduced or trapped by only the follies and fears which kept him in the arms of Calypso. When you mention Hemingway, the famous line in his book, The Man and the Old Sea, came to my mind. We can be destroyed, humans can be destroyed, but they should never give up, Hemingway wrote there. And isn't that what has really brought Europe back time and again, helped us to bounce back out of any kind of downhill vicissitude into a new cycle of, let's say, imagination. You asked the question, a very thoughtful one, why 1950 became possible at all. And my humble answer would be, well, because the destruction of monopolies was considered to be something good by everybody. The destruction of the monopoly to wage war, the destruction of the monopoly to dominate the economy. And I would say intellectually, even I would say educationally, psychologically speaking, the destruction of the monopoly of our respective forms and expressions of self-righteousness. We all had to learn that Europe thrives if many Balkanies are existing, as you nicely described it in the beginning. But you gave us also food for thought to deal with the rather sober and problematic side. And that brings us to the first question, which I like to raise from the audience. Lisa Gilardi asked, how is Europe, Western Europe, becoming, as Professor Segers, you said, becoming more and more like Eastern Europe? You used the term vulnerable. How is it, how is this trend, she asked, linked with the end of Europe's transatlantic rush? Maybe you could give Ms. Gilardi right away a good answer, please.
Happily prepared to do so. I think this is a very topical question, and I put it a bit in provocative terms. But what I mean is that we in Western Europe, where the Europe of European integration started in the 1950s, were also in a more and more comfortable situation during the post-war decades due to the protection that the American government gave us through NATO, but also in reality by its defense capacity. And in that comfortable situation where we didn't have to worry too much about our own safety, we also lost a bit touch with the brute realities, as I call them, of geography and geopolitics. And those brute realities are back again. You know, you only have to look at the Ukrainian-Russian border at the moment to see how this plays out. And there is where I see the link with Eastern Europe. I think that Eastern European populations are more realistic about the present situation and position of the European, of the Europe of European integration than we in Western Europe are, because they are far more closer to that violent history that also is a constant line through the longer history of Europe, and they are aware of the real dangers that are apparent at the moment, and try to signal these, and also try to alarm and notify the other Europeans, mainly in the West, to become more realistic. And I think that is a call that we don't register precisely enough in the West of Europe. And I think we should do that soon, because these threats are real.
Thank you. Giuseppe Cacciato, I take it from his name, sits on another nice European balcony, the Italian one, I believe. He is wondering whether the historical enlargement cycle was maybe wrong. He even says it was a disaster whose historical consequences have weighed heavily on EU citizens' lives and will preclude the European integration process from effective progress during our lifetimes. Quite a stark comment. How would you respond to this?
Yes, the enlargement process, of course, is one of the big challenges of European integration up till the present day, and very topical indeed. On the other hand, I think, and that is important to underline, that the enlargement policy is the only true geopolitical instrument that the European Union has, and is also perceived as a geopolitical instrument by others outside the European integration process, for instance, Russia. And I think this is important to underline, because our present day President of the European Commission, Ms. Ursula von der Leyen, underlined that she wants her commission to be the first geopolitical commission in the history of European integration. I think there are arguments to give that she is right about that, although it may also be an overly ambitious statement. But we leave that for another discussion. I think there are arguments to make in the present situation that she is right about this new priority of geopolitics. And in that perspective, the enlargement process is a very, very crucial instrument in the arsenal of the European Union, where European common army does not exist. So I think there are two sides to this story. Yes, it's a real stress test for the European integration, this enlargement process. But on the other hand, it also matches the growing up, the geopolitical growing up of the European Union in present day international relations, where this is urgently needed, actually, this geopolitical growing up.
Thank you. The presence of Professor Willy Meyers from the University of Missouri here in our conversation proves that the transatlantic era, the American century, as you said, has not really come to an end. The transatlantic community is still alive. And Professor Meyers from Missouri is wondering whether what you have just discussed, the vicissitudes and the vulnerability, maybe also this speedy enlargement to the east, does all of this explain, in your view, the rise of illiberal democracies?
Yes, to a certain extent it does, and I'm very happy that we have also audience outside of Europe, and especially from America. So thank you very much for this question. And yes, I think so. So this enlargement process has indeed speeded up developments. But what is, I think, the most important here is that it reflects, and that is also what the question is about, that there is a rebound effect here, that it kind of re-enters the societies of the member states of the European Union in a polarizing way, indeed, because the world after the Cold War, which was a frozen world to a certain extent, now the real world of international relations re-enters Europe, and not only Europe, but the whole world. In Europe, also because we have democracies, it also enters democratic debate. And in that, it is a polarizing force where different worldviews clash, and to a certain extent, more extreme alternatives blossom and flourish on these grounds of polarization. And in this category of more extreme alternatives, these illiberal models are gaining traction and also are very real within the European Union in certain member states at this very moment. And that is why I stressed in my lecture this heart of the European integration process, and the core of the idea, if there's one idea. One of the things there in that core is what Professor Kühnhardt already mentioned, the battle against monopoly. But one of the other things is the openness and the priority of human rights in dealing with relations between peoples within societies, freedom of thought, and that should be put, I think, upfront in battling those illiberal democracies, and should also be put upfront in a clear-cut way. Nowadays, because of this success on the right end of the political spectrum in many member states, speaking politically, it's dealt with in a not clear-cut enough opposition. So it's also viewed as interesting, this illiberal model. It's viewed as seductive by a certain part of society and media, and that is very dangerous. And that is why I tried to stress today what is, in my view, at the core of this historic undertaking of European integration, but still very young undertaking. Let's not forget this. It's still very young and therefore very vulnerable. Also in institutional terms, what is at the core of this undertaking is exactly the opposite of these illiberal democracies. But because of the vulnerability of the process and also the lack of self-knowledge of us Europeans, when it comes to the process of European integration, we are tending to find this illiberal model too interesting, according to my view. We should push it away in more clear terms as something that does not belong in the Europe that we try to protect through European integration.
I'm very happy that you refer to the fact that European integration is a very young and novel process. When Mao Zedong was asked to give a final judgment on the French Revolution 200 years later, he said it is all too early to say. And probably this is for sure true for European integration, which, as you rightly said, is so young. You discussed very intensively the 90s, this turning point, kind of where the destruction of monopolies, to come back to this term on which we obviously agree, opened new spaces, let's say, for freedom and the future to thrive. And Europeans were no longer trapped to just look back to 2000 years of a big and proud cultural history in order to define what they want to do together and in common. And Sam van der Vlucht is asking, whom do you identify as the protagonists in the maintenance of this narrative of the European 90s? And he adds, how can this history be shielded from the national political mobilization of history?
That's a very complicated but very relevant question. I can say a few things about this. It actually asks for another lecture, but I will not give that, obviously. I can say a few things about this. The first thing, how to protect this openness. This is very much about also the other points that we addressed already. I think to link to the former question, this is a young process. The collective memory of the process is also very young. If you compare it to the collective memory, for instance, that is present in nation states, that goes back often for centuries and is therefore much deeper collective memory than the collective memory of European integration, is still only a couple of decades and just longer than one generation. So in this battle of collective memories, European integration has a disadvantage because of this. So if times are uncertain and people look for certainty, they will go back in collective memory, and the most deep collective memory has an advantage over a much younger collective memory, like the European integration collective memory. But in this collective memory of European integration, there is this special time of 10 years, especially in Western Europe, between the fall of the Berlin Wall and 9/11, where there was this real feeling, more cultural than in practice, that another time had begun. And I think these 10 years, they are present in myself, like they are present in the people who experienced that same period consciously. That is not lost. We didn't capitalize enough on that moment, I think, of 10 years. So if we look back, and I'm very critical about the opportunities that the European Union has capitalized on in those 10 years. Yes, a lot happened, so deepening and enlargement, but very much on the technocratic policy front and not on the front of politics and ideas. And that is where we now lose the battle of collective memories, because we didn't nurture and cherish that that ideas component that was present then, and we now are very close to losing it. And I think that is very important for our generation, because we know that we have it in us, as it were. Just like Federica Mogherini, that's why I quoted her several times, has phrased it in her speech in Maastricht. This world, that moment is not gone. It's still with us, with our generations. It's our responsibility to a certain moment to now, when we, especially the generations that are somewhat older now, like the generation of Federica Mogherini, to now capitalize on this unique moment of openness, and in that way also correct the missed opportunities of the 90s in terms of political ideas, culture, and deeper understanding of the Europe, of European integration. This is about more than technocracy, internal market, and monetary union. That is what I tried to say about the 90s. We still can save the 90s spirit, so to say, if we dare to go over that boundary of policy and technocracy to the realm of politics and ideas.
But then if we get into the realm of politics, sometimes skeptical questions can be very shrewd, like the following one from Kühnhardt. He is a very distinguished Dutch journalist who has worked a lot in the Baltics and is currently, believe it or not, in the middle of Corona, doing a postgraduate master at my institute, Master of European Studies, Governance and Regulation at Bonn University. And Kühn is asking whether the concept of European strategic autonomy is not emerging all too late, considering the ongoing transatlantic drift. What do you think, Professor Segers?
To a large extent, I agree. It's very late. It's very, very late. It should have been developed in those 90s. And there were some lingering initiatives, but they never came to fruition, and especially not in the treaties. So I agree, but it's maybe not too late. It's very important that this insight now has taken a priority position on the European agenda, and it's maybe the first priority. And it's also hopeful that it is built upon the logics and mechanisms of the internal market. So it doesn't need an extra new treaty change or something else. It's more or less working with what was available all the time, but was not used by the member states because of national disagreements between the member states as such. So I think, and one important other aspect, of course, here is Brexit. It's because of Brexit that those stalemates that were especially present in this policy domain are now away for an important extent, and that we can now use the possibilities that are there within the treaties to give this strategic autonomy some real flesh to the bones, so to say. It's late, I fully agree, but it's maybe not too late, and it might get into a catalysator, so to say, because of the present day developments on the borders of the European Union. It's crucial that it's taken to the next level, I think.
I agree, and would like to kind of maybe shape a little bit one comparison when we talk about whether something is too late or too early. There is no too late in history, because if we believe in the openness of history, there are always new chances. And when we look back to the 1990s and the late 80s, why has Europe not developed a common, let's say, common European sovereignty, a common coherent foreign policy? I'm old enough to have lived that period, also close to the then German government circles. And I remember vividly that the Yugoslavian wars, the outbreak of the Yugoslavian wars, really at that time destroyed all the dreams for a common European and security policy. And in all cabinets across Western Europe, the leading politicians consulted history books again. How did we connect, and with whom did we connect in Sarajevo 1914? And sometimes it sounds cynical with hindsight knowledge to say, but sometimes, I still am relieved to see that Western Europe did not go to war with each other over the outbreak of new conflicts in the Balkans at that time. This sounds lunatic maybe from today's perspective, but this is what it was. The Balkan War, the outbreak of conflicts, the dissolution of Yugoslavia destroyed the dreams of a swift and speedy path towards a political union. And if you compare this to the strength and cohesive position across the EU today, and also across NATO today, in view of the threats to the territorial integrity in Ukraine, I think we have gone quite a long way, and credit goes to people, as you rightly said, Mathieu, like Federica Mogherini and others, also Josep Borrell today, who represents a coherent European answer to this threat, not just to our illusions, but to the very basic foundations of the reality of a free and peaceful life. So I just wanted to add this before I move to the next question by Dunya Nasser, who, being a student of history, is asking you, Professor Segers, she would love to learn more about the very subject you have addressed here tonight, and could you refer and recommend to some more books she could read, beside, of course, your own wonderful contributions to this debate?
Yes, that is a very nice question, actually. She also may send me an email, and then I can be somewhat more elaborate in the course of the coming days. But a book that comes to mind now immediately is the recently published book by the historian Stella Gerva under the title Conquering Peace, from the Enlightenment to the European Union. And this is a very general but very nicely done comprehensive history of centuries of European history, with the end point at the moment, the Europe of European integration. Very interesting and thought-provoking conceptual lines and consistencies run through this book. So I recommend that in the first place, and I will think of other recommendations. So Conquering Peace by Stella Gerva, published by Harvard University Press.
Thank you, Mathieu. Kęstutis Kupsis comes to us from Lithuania. He was a student there in the early 1990s and remembers very vividly that unstoppable feel, as he says, penetrating all public and private lives at the time. All is possible, and we, meaning all of us, are masters of our own future. How, if you look back, Mathieu, how can we explain why this has come somehow to an end, and what role does the following play? Isn't it that while the Americans embarked, at least after 2001, on this new world-defining event of 9/11, we Europeans had already embarked on this world-transforming event of 11/9, namely the 9th of November, the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Americans obviously were not really part maybe of the party to jubilate the fall of the wall, but they were not part of the transformation of European integration that followed afterwards. So how do you judge the particular position of the Baltic states in this new Europe, because they also bring balconies to this European continent, enrich us very much, and feel safe now because of this double inclusion in NATO and in the EU?
Yes, there's a question about a lot of things. I fully agree that the Baltic states are an essential part, actually, of the present-day European Union in several ways. Not only because they are on a sort of front line and trying to manage very real problems that also trickle down in the rest of the European Union when it comes to geopolitics and real threats and realpolitik. That is something that we also have to get used to again in Western Europe. And I think there too, you know, the Eastern Europeans are in front of us, comparing Eastern Europe to Western Europe in realpolitik. So, and I also think, you know, there are very topical examples that are real best practices, actually, in the European Union in this geopolitical realm coming from the Baltics, like, for instance, the position Lithuania chooses vis-a-vis the problems around Taiwan. And that is a very strong stance, and that kind of gives, you know, that enlightens a new path that Europe has to go. And I think this is important also because, Professor Kühnhardt, you rightly raised the Balkans area as a kind of example in the 90s of how difficult these problems were, and how real, of course, the horrors of war were at the European soil at that moment, and how far we have become. But on the other hand, what we need now in the Balkans, and I stressed it 2 times in my lecture just in passing, because I think it's very important, we need to keep the eye on the geopolitical ball as a European Union, and a very important element in that is the present situation in the Balkans, which is destabilizing in certain aspects when it comes, for instance, to Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I think, you know, kind of in the line of what Federica Mogherini has done, there we should really not let those regions go, as it were, out of our perspective and view on the geopolitical position of the European Union. This is exactly about these regions, like it was in the 90s about the Baltics, for instance. And I think it's a great enrichment that we have the Baltics on board in the European Union. They obviously and clearly belong to that cooperation of member states that the European Union is. But on the other hand, we have to get real about the consequences this had in the eyes of others. And that is also something that we have to grow up very soon, that we see that the European Union potentially is a player in world politics and should also behave like that. And that comes with realpolitik, especially in those sensitive areas that border regions always are, especially at the borders of the European Union. And the Balkans is, I think, at the moment a very important priority when it comes to geopolitics, also vis-a-vis Russia.
Thank you. Vanessa Lazatin has the privilege of asking the last question here during our conference today. And I warn you, Matthew, this question is extremely stimulating, extremely short, and extremely cruel. She asked you, with your deep knowledge of Europe's history, what will be the 3 words, maximum 3 phrases, on how you describe the Europe of European integration in the past, in the present, and in the future. 3 words, maximum 3 phrases to answer Ms. Lazatin.
Yes, that is indeed a very stimulating question. I think it's best to refer to something that I said in my lecture, namely that the insight in this social condition that I took from this beautiful book of Roger Martin Dugard, that man is powerless without others, and that where others are powerless, he or she is too. I think that should be at the heart of European integration, that lesson.
Thank you. That was a very short and smart and thoughtful answer indeed. Your reflection and also the stimulating question of Vanessa Lazatin gave me a moment to also reflect on this. And I would say my answer would be Europe is a learning community. It has the privilege to be a permanent, collective, and individual learning community in which we are forced to and in which we benefit from thinking and looking through the eyes and the perspectives of all the others. Europe benefits from the destruction of monopolies, as we have already discussed earlier, and that is an ongoing process. There will be clashes of interest. Look at the current debate on the taxonomy of what green energy is, for instance. Europe has to accept that only through destruction of monopolies we open the future and avenues, and destroying monopolies always means we need to respect the minorities, that is, those who are losing sort of in any equation. And so those who accept majority voting but have to be with us and want to be with us in Europe whenever they are in a minority position. I think this also comes with the strength of destroying a monopoly, to find always a balance time and again between majorities and minorities. And the third point really is Europe still is in a very complicated learning process to really grasp what the challenges of what I call the global turn require us to do to defend ourselves in a complicated world, as Joseph Borrell recently said, not a world defined by the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant, but in a world rather close to Thomas Hobbes' idea that many wolves have been unleashed all over again. And Europe cannot just survive with nice reference to our norms only if we do not learn to be also capable of surviving in a very robust way and realistic way in the world as it is and as it affects us more than ever before, probably since the beginning of this process, which began under the protective umbrella of the United States, which was not only at the peak of its power in the 1940s, but which opened also a process in its own history, which I have labeled earlier the a period of enlightened self-interest. To see Europe thriving happened not out of charity affections, but out of an American enlightened self-interest. And now it's on Europe to learn this lesson of acting out of enlightened self-interest if we want to remain capable of being the master of our own destiny in a world which is very complex. It includes elements of multilateralism and of cooperative recognition of common rules, but it is also a world where new forms of very rigid, very brutal power politics have come up again, and also cultural clashes have reached the shores of Europe. I think all this leaves us food for thought for further reflections. And on behalf of all of us, I want to express my deep gratitude and thanks to you, Mathieu, for a wonderful lecture and also very thoughtful remarks and contributions during our Q&A session. I think we all have learned a lot from Professor Segers here today. For me, bottom line really of this learning in experience this afternoon was the fact that maybe in the end of the day, it is not just Odysseus and Calypso that pave our way, but surely also Sisyphus, the other great mythological figure which guides us time and again with his inspiring thoughts that we have to roll the ball or the stone, the rock rather, uphill time and again to not lose our way, to achieve our goals, to remain self-critical, skeptical, thoughtful, but not looking too much back, because it would only facilitate that we fall into the abyss of history. And that surely would be a position not even Odysseus would have dreamt of in the worst of his fears when being in the wonderful, beautiful arms of Calypso. So thank you very much, Professor Segers, for this very inspiring conversation this afternoon. I think you have given credit more than we could all have hoped for the enormous inspirational power which the House of European History is projecting even now during these complicated times of the pandemic, where we cannot meet in person, but where we have the opportunity to come together in a transatlantic way across Europe to have been able to spend this very enriching afternoon hour with you. And I'm sure many of your thoughts will continue to work in our brains and will inspire us in the next paths through the next vicissitudes of European integration. Thanks a lot and have a good evening to all of you. Goodbye.